try this again. So this program is sponsored by our friends of the library, so we thank them for their support. And thank you to our committee members for all the work that they do to put this program together. Today's speaker is Diana Redding. She is the director of the Corku Free Library and a past member of the Tale for Three Counties Committee. Diana was raised on a small dairy farm and has her bachelor's degree in English. She's an avid reader and podcast listener, and she's involved in the community, volunteering for programs like Leadership Genesis Arts, Culture, and Diversity Day. And I knew Diana liked to read, and I know she loves animals, so I thought, and she'd read this book, so it was a really perfect fit. So, reviewing Fuzz by Mary Roach, Diana Redding.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the invite. Thank you for coming. So, as Sam said, so I do work in a library, so I do have access to books. However, nonfiction is not a big genre for me. I tend to only read like 10 to 12 nonfiction books per year. And it tends to be very just random nonfiction. However, when Sam contacted me, I happened to be reading one of the books that was put on the list as a potential topic. So I said, well, let's go for it. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Mary Roach. She's a well-known nonfiction writer. Very interesting titles. I will just read some of them. Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers. Spook, Science Tackles the Afterlife. Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life and the Void. And actually, Packing for Mars just came out in a children's edition. Gulp. So, yes, so we've read, I think, just one of her books previously for our book club. And this is Fuzz, When Nature Breaks the Law, about human-wildlife conflict and what happens. So I was actually just listening to a podcast with her being interviewed. So there is, I believe, 15 chapters covering a range of human-wildlife conflict, but there's also plants and trees included, so it's different. So it was also, it started off, good intro, strong start, and then I'm like, well, how did she pick, right, these topics? So in the podcast, she did say that she had started off by wanting to, she read a paper, I'm not going to tell you what it is. If you want to ask me later off the recording, I will tell you. So she had reached out and she wanted to work with some government agencies on smuggling. But they said, for any open investigation, basically, no, you can't. So she likes to tag along and be really involved. So then that led to the animals in this book that she covered. So basically anyone that had science kind of happening, new research, and they would allow her to tag along. So she's quite funny. I don't know, like I said, if you are familiar, but her books are funny. She does cover some serious topics in this book, but her footnotes are also hilarious. I was deciding whether I should read any of them. I was like, I'm going to pass on that one. So she covers everything. So some is like the US and Canada, and then she does travel to India. And then she covers some more historical, and then ends up on like gene editing. So it's quite interesting. All of the chapters do segue very nicely to each other. However, the first time when I picked this up, I did read it more stop and starts, and it was okay. So if you just wanted to read a couple of the chapters or essays, I think that would be fine. You wouldn't have to sit down and just read it all in one go. So I'm just going to briefly kind of outline some of the chapters. The first chapter is when she is working with some Canadian and US officers. It's an organization called WART, but it's Wildlife Human Attack Response Training, WHART, where they had some officers from the Conservation Officer Service from Canada come down to do a training where there was cadavers involved, where they had to try and figure out what happened and what might have attacked this person. So that was a good chapter. That was a good lead-in. And then the second chapter is breaking and entering and eating. How do you handle a hungry bear? So generally, each of the chapters does focus on a particular species, but it also, she likes to meet people really, and so you get to know some of the people that she meets, what they do in their day-to-day job. So what about the bears? It's quite interesting as a potentially very large predator so I believe she's in Aspen, Colorado at this point, where they've struggled with being such a touristy destination, high density, and being so close to bears. So there are local laws about your garbage cans, but it's difficult with restaurants and people who multiple parties that may use one dumpster to figure out who it is and to find them. So yeah, she was doing a ride along, and it was at night, and of course they ran into two, I believe, black bears, just going to town on the garbage. But it's very frustrating because as the bears become acclimated to coming into these places, and it's basically, especially if they are getting ready to hibernate and they need so many calories, it's like garbage is great. Restaurant outside, or dumpster outside of a restaurant. But then when it comes in with human conflict. So this chapter did discuss the two-strike policy for bears, and they talked about non-lethal ways of managing conflict, but that does not go well. So sometimes there is some anger towards humans who they blame for not being responsible, about their garbage or their trash, because then the bear usually is euthanized. Relocation does not work quite well. So they've done various studies, so they're really trying to work with the community. They actually have a local law for building that you can't have French door handles, because they actually call them bear handles because they're so easy for the bears just to walk in. So this one, so they did talk a little bit about, basically with the restaurants, but then they talked about cabins and different bears breaking into cabins, and some are very delicate. They talked about one bear just like removing a window screen and setting it gently next. Some they don't ransack, they'll just go and open the refrigerator, like they eat ice cream, they will eat a jar of honey. So as I was reading this chapter, it's funny, it wasn't the second time around, it reminded me a little bit, which I meant to look it up, but Sam may be able to help me. Do you remember it was a nonfiction book about a man who lived in Maine?
The Stranger in the Woods.
Stranger in the Woods, thank you.
That's what I was thinking when you were saying
ransacking.
ransacking.
So there was a man who, when he was very young, I think post-college maybe, he decided he was just kind of done. He lived in Maine, but he wasn't like a survivalist. He went around to like the seasonal Maine cabins and just stole things, whether it was food. A lot of the times he needed like batteries and propane tanks. So some people, so there's an element of fear. Other people said, he's really only taking what he needs, so then they would start leaving the things out for him. So this kind of, in a weird way, reminded me of this chapter of some people, they don't want to see any harm to the bears. But the issue becomes then too, especially if a homeowner is there or they have a pet, especially a dog, and a bear is breaking in, that's when you tend to see issues. So that was an interesting chapter, I think, because, it was somewhat relatable, happening in the U.S. And I've actually never seen a bear in my area in New York State, so I'm not sure about you. Oh, and then randomly too, I believe this was right in Aspen too, the city planted crabapple trees everywhere. And then the bears come and they just have a little feast, and then you can be now ticketed if you try and take a selfie when the bear is eating from the crabapple trees. So yeah, different, you know. So then we go from Colorado to India, where she covers wild elephants. This chapter I thought was also very interesting. Fun fact of let's see, it was wild elephants on average kill 47 people a year. 36% of those people are drunk. So there is that element as well. 8% are sleeping inside their home. So some of the examples that she gave, it's not considered intentional or malicious. Sometimes when the elephants panic and run, they trample, or it's just accidental, like they, roll over on you type thing. So, however, though, the issue is mostly for farmers in India so there used to be more well-defined elephant corridors where they would go these certain routes every year. And now they become pocketed elephants where they basically become stuck, they start running out of food, so then they turn to the villages. That causes sometimes lethal for both the elephant and humans. Villagers who are upset because they can come in one night and destroy their farm, their crops for a year. So they want to retaliate. But shooting an elephant is illegal in India. And there was also maybe interesting is the wrong word, side note. I don't know if any of you may remember this. I do not. I did a little bit of research, couldn't find much. But in 1992, there was a circus elephant named Janet in Palm Bay, Florida, who became very upset, and she left the circus, and that had to be taken care of by the local police. So yeah, I've never heard of that, but that's generally how she is. Like, she'll be, in a chapter and then just throw something out like that. And then from there, talking about elephants, and so there's various awareness days that Indian wildlife rangers will go out to try and educate the community what they can do to prevent elephants from coming into their village. They're now working on using sensors, kind of like similar to earthquake monitors, that would alert the villagers, and then the villagers would call a professional to come try and divert the elephants versus the villagers trying to handle things on their own. So then we stay in India for the next chapter because the elephant chapter ends on a tea estate, which was also just quite unique. There's some interesting that you might want to read at the end of that chapter. So I will step back here to say that I would say the overall tone of this book is light. She doesn't go into more serious, that she could, actually going back to bears, and this says for black bears. So she does reference climate change because of warmer temperatures, that it is shortening the length of bears' hibernation. So this went on to say that by 2050, black bears will be hibernating 50 to 40 days less than they are now. So there are very, serious issues in this book that she touches upon but doesn't really go into. So India with the tea estate, she references that, it's a bit left over from, British colonialism, that these people are working for. It's basically like slave labor, and she was comparing that to elephants in India that actually work, that once they reach 50 years of age, like they're allowed to retire. And then comparing it to these people working on these tea estates. So we end on a tea estate, but then that segues into the next chapter because 90% of leopard attacks in North Bengal happen on tea estates. So there you go. So now we're on to leopards, which I also didn't know, so this is in my notes and my shirt today, that mountain lion, cougars, puma, llamas, and panthers are all regional names for the same species. So that was always very confusing to me, so I'm glad that I now am aware of that. India does have, she goes into a story about man-eaters, basically kind of legendary stories about leopards going after humans. Today, mostly, they tend to be females that have cubs to feed. And then they talk about the differences between defensive and predatory behavior, or she puts it as provoked or unprovoked attacks. And then this is also, she does say that there's as much frustration both with the leopards as with the government. Very sad, it is mentioned that sometimes children are attacked because they are walking to school at the times when the animals are out. But she did say, if they had better transportation and then better access to ambulances and hospitals, more people could probably be saved after these attacks. Oh, okay, so now we are still, I just looked chapter 5, we're still in India. She did spend quite a bit of time in India, and then I didn't write down their names, but you do meet quite a few characters in India who helped her along her way. Okay, so now we're talking about monkeys and birth control. So, I just feel like I'm reeling off potentially fun facts for the day that you may or may not want to share with people. So they are working in India to try and, a contraceptive vaccine is what they call it, but they want to have them to be permanent. So rounding up a massive number of monkeys to give them an injection and then to have to give them a booster, is just not going to work. But the issue is also India, with its large Hindu population, they do not kill animals, and they call them, I didn't have it written down, but basically like monkey catchers, which even that is difficult to find people to do that job. So that was from 1972, the Wildlife Protection Act. It's illegal to kill or capture wild animals. But, however, these monkeys do make a nuisance of themselves. There has been some issues where maybe they have caused some deaths or caused people to fall. So what they like to do is, if you're carrying something that they may want, they will jump down and try and grab it from you. So, of course, Mary Roach, being Mary Roach, she actually wanted to be purposefully mugged by a monkey. So she purposely walked down the street, had someone recording her as she was basically carrying bananas. So that was a funny little anecdote. And the one thing that tied it back to the U.S. that she mentions is the U.S. works primarily in wild horse populations, both out west on government-owned lands. And she mentioned Assateague Island, where they do to control the population. So that was interesting. As a horse person myself, it's been interesting to follow how they try and manage the wild horse populations, mostly in the West, as there's drought right now, so then that decreases the number of horses that they say that an acre of land can provide for. So there's been more pressure for more roundups. Wild horse adoptions are not as popular as they once were, so they've been working on these birth control mechanisms to try and help keep the populations down. That's an aside. So then we go from India back to the U.S. and cougars. She meets a man named Justin, who his job is to try and count mountain lions. He does it much more scientifically, but basically he goes and he tries to track mountain lions, and he can tell if it's a male or female. That was a funny chapter, as she was, out with him, just, on the four-wheeler, tagging along. So that was a good one. And she does also reference the U.S. history of being not so nice to animals, of certain animals they attempted to eradicate and now that we're trying to bring back. So then we'll just move quickly. She has a chapter on trees and people who monitor trees that go through forest and say what is a danger tree that might be in jeopardy. Sometimes they will take the whole tree down, sometimes they'll just take limbs. But they also leave some trees, if they take the top off, they'll leave the rest for it to basically rot down and then it can be a home for other animals. There was a man she met whose title was Falling Safety Advisor. She likes titles of the people that she meets. Then we go into, she calls them terror beans, where she talks about the rosary pea plant, that possession is legal, but the seeds can be made into the most lethal phytotoxin on Earth. So then she goes into talking about castor beans, which is where we get ricin from. And then it goes a little dark. That moves to rat poison in World War II, and then more pest control. And then that goes into a few chapters about birds, which I have to say, birds are not my favorite. I feel like they're kind of scary. I generally won't go into a store, like if they're hanging out, like I'll wait for them to leave. But however, we were not nice to birds, and just things that, you know, you may have not, like the unintended consequences of something being, where did it go? At one point, one of the companies moved to use sunflower oil, like potato chip companies, that sort of thing. So now they have these massive fields of sunflowers, and that attracted birds. So what do? Do we try and poison these birds? And then what happens? Then we poison other species, so mostly blackbirds, but then they found out that they were poisoning all of these other types of birds. Yeah, so the birds is not good. But apparently, like back in the 50s too, like they used to like detonate bombs to try and scare them away. She talks about scarecrows not being effective. She talks about just, you know, maybe we should just go back to using human scarers, which seems to be the most effective. So the one, chapter 10 was interesting because it is the National Wildlife Strike Database, which it can anything from birds to deer. So a lot with the birds, they're at airports and that type of thing, which I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with. But also, like, apparently sometimes they have issues with deer being like on the tarmac. But the one thing, so basically throughout this book, I was like, wow, I'm kind of glad that there are very smart people working on these problems that I was not aware of. So they do have a patent pending because they do lots of testing on what they call spatial margin of safety and what Mary Roach calls the deer in the headlights project. So I'm sure for all of us at some point we have been affected by this. So they are now working to patent a light bar that illuminates the vehicle's grille. So that, because basically the deer sees lights, but they don't have an understanding that there's a very large object hurtling toward them. So they are trying to illuminate basically more of the car for the deer to see that there is danger approaching and that I should move out of the way. So that one I thought was interesting and maybe someday will be relevant to all of our lives here. There was a funny one too, we're back to birds, about vultures in Everglades National Park, where they would come in and they would tear off the windshield wipers of all the cars. So then they did try and, so they do a lot of like hanging effigies. So basically, for blackbirds, for vultures, they get a dead bird, and there can't just be a dead bird, like it has to be like somewhat sinister. So it worked, the vultures worked, but then the rangers were just constantly asked, why are there vultures hanging? So now there is just a sign that says, please put a tarp over your windshield. So lots of random things, yes, that so now if you go to Everglades National Park, you might want to bring a second set of windshield wipers just in case. Then she randomly talks about the Vatican and the Pope. So I guess in 2017, Easter Mass, it was quite the disaster. They had set up all of the flowers and plants, and the next morning, they awoke to find them all spilled. So they had been dive bombed. So then the next year became this whole big thing. They had people come in with like lasers to try and keep the birds away. So yeah, you never know. You never quite know where you're going. Sometimes in the next chapter. And then she goes to a chapter on New Zealand for invasive species kill around 25 million native New Zealand species, or actually I think mostly birds. As an island, they did not have land predators until they were introduced. So now they are dealing with how should we humanely. That chapter is also a little bit dark. And then chapter 15, the last chapter about mice and trying to edit the gene so that mice cannot produce female offspring. So then trying to introduce gene-edited mice into wild populations and what that would be like. And she did preface that chapter with that while they're doing this research, these mice have to be kept in escape-proof cages. So that was an interesting one where, she'll briefly mention, like, for example, like Jane Goodall is against gene editing. And then she kind of, interesting, and she brings it, she is at like a feedlot. He's a commercial rancher, and she's describing like the piles of corn, and he's just like, yeah, he was like, I don't actually know how much I'm losing to the birds and the mice, but it's okay. So that's like giving her, she ends it on, I would say, a hopeful note that we can manage to coexist, because as you might imagine, we haven't been very successful with our attempts. I didn't include this, but it was a very also disturbing about how they try to deal with I believe they were the albatross on Midway, which was eventually closed in 1993, but it was not good. So we don't want to get too depressed. So I will end also on a light note that as I was reading this made headlines maybe for a week, less than 1 week, I don't know. But it is for the U.S. government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for a salary of almost $100,000 for a grizzly bear conflict manager. And this was like part of the job listing. It involves managing a team of 2 to 4 with tasks including trapping, chemical immobilization, monitoring, conflict prevention, and relocation efforts. So this would be in Montana. And it also notes that the successful applicant will not be spending much time in the adequately lighted, heated, and ventilated office. There's a substantial amount of field work, extended periods of camping in tents or cabins, and remote field camps. So this one made me laugh. The incumbent may be subject to large numbers of biting insects and may be required to work in close proximity to large animals such as bear and moose. Adding that the conflict manager may have to carry a gun for protection. So I just thought that was interesting because I was like, oh, that sounds fun. And I was like, no, it's not. But that is in a very brief summary of Fuzz. I would say, even if you're not, this doesn't sound necessarily like your type of book. Mary Roach does this much better than I am describing it, and she's much funnier. And like I said, her footnotes some of them are hilarious. It does tend to be where some of the more inappropriate material is, but as a nonfiction read, I really enjoyed this. I would say I would recommend it to most, and I have thought about, you know, also possibly doing this for our book club at the library at some point. So I think it would have some interesting conversations. So I will, if there's any questions, I will try and answer. Yes.
Does she get into, I know people have put animals on trial before for
Yes.
crimes. Does she get into that at all?
She doesn't get into it, but that is briefly mentioned in the intro, which ranging from pigs to caterpillars. That is one way that she started getting into this subject, when she came across this text and she was like, wait, is this real? And it ended up, yes, it was real. So it was caterpillars, rats, weevils, you know, going after a crop. So yeah, it's a 1906 book, The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals. So yes, that I feel like would also be more to be fleshed out, but yeah, she just mentions it in the introduction of that. So, but oh, she does talk about, okay, so kind of going off that. She does talk about when there, especially when there are lethal, like cougar or bear attacks against humans. Now they are very careful to test the DNA before they dispatch the animal to make sure that they have the correct one. And there also is a conversation about words that we use. Dispatch being one, or lethal dispatch. Yes, about how we term this. So, yes. And, you know, anything from, I think they did for bears for relocation too. But I mean, just how difficult it is and how frustrating it can be, like the bears, the albatross, they just come back. They just come back to what they know. So there's limited success with relocation. Yes?
This is a comment. When we were children, it was a big treat. We would go for a ride in the evening to the dump to watch the black bears in the Allegheny State Park. And it was like there were just cars lined up.
Really?
It was like an event. But yes, there was a fear factor. You know, we were hovering and the bears would not come over toward the car because they were going through the garbage in the dump. But yeah, that was a big treat. We go look at the bears. And,
speaking of the dump, she actually also visits a landfill, and the person kind of walks away in a huff because they were like, you said the 4-letter word. She used the word dump. And apparently you're not supposed to. So he was,
my age is
he was very offended that was in the chapter also though about birds and how they come. So, and apparently the real estate agents were telling people that this landfill was going to close in 2 years, and it hasn't. So people are upset. So they're upset by it, and so they talk about just like the various ways. This one they mentioned. They have what was it? It's a robotic falcon, basically, that came all the way from like maybe the Netherlands with a pilot, and it would really simulate what a real falcon would do, and that would come in and try and scare them off. But then sometimes they would also they recommend having a real falcon come in to actually then have some real consequences. Let's just say. So yeah, so that they'll keep.
well, but it was called a dump 70 years ago.
Yes. No, and according to Mary Roach, it still is. But yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because there was a few pages that dealt with that, about then sometimes the landfill manager, so they would scare the birds away, and then they would go into the surrounding area where it was more residential, and then he would have to, she said, hand out coupons for the car wash to everyone. So, yeah.
I think we read that same book, didn't we, Leslie? That Stranger in the Woods. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, we read that from
Did
the
we?
discussion.
Was it? Okay, no.
Yeah, a year or
yeah.
two ago.
Yeah, it was-
2 years ago, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, it was funny that I don't know why, it was like, but it was like my second time when I was rereading this that I randomly thought, it's like, oh.
He drove up and then threw his keys away.
Yeah, he just
Yeah,
left his,
yeah, and just
left
walked
his car
off
in the
into
forest and walked
Yes,
away.
yeah.
Yep.
I believe it was the Netherlands that actually has a program where they use falcons to take out nuisance drones.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
okay, well, you could do that too.
Snatch.
Yes, yeah.
And that could be a real thriving business for someone.
Yes, if you are
I know, I would like to play one of them once in a while.
The city of Rochester has a Falcon program where they have nest boxes and cameras set up and trying to restore the falcons. Falcons were introduced to try to eliminate pigeons. That was their,
Oh, okay.
that was their purpose or their job, but there's still falcon boxes at a couple buildings in Rochester.
I do joke that, so, you know, I have a barn and we do have mice and moles, and I'm with where Mary Roach comes to the end, where so she sees a rat at her house, and so she decides not to do anything about it. They patched like where it was coming in, so she would say occasionally she saw it, and so now she's more about like this peaceful coexistence, which I would like to be in my barn, but they terrify me. But I joke that like I wouldn't mind, like if it's nature, a falcon or an owl just happened. Where are you guys? Come on, you're done. You're done here. Yes, yeah, and I also refuse to get a barn cat, so that's also why. So.
Any other questions for Diana? All right, well, thank you.
You are very welcome. Thank you for